All right, so today I am going to make some more of this yellow paint. This is my favorite yellow paint because it is safe to sand. I sand my paintings oftentimes in between layers, sometimes just to make sure that the physical bond between the layers of paint is going to be sound and stable. Sometimes it's just to smooth out the impasto of the paint before I make a change or a modification to the design. And sometimes it's just to remove texture that's just a bit too much. And sometimes it's just to create painterly effects. Either way, I sand my paintings. And because I sand my paintings, it is unsafe to use paint like cadmium and many other toxic pigments. And a nice opaque warm yellow that's very relatively high in tinting strength and light fastness isn't easy to find on the market right now. And I've found one that really works well for me. It's this Bristol yellow medium from Kremer, not like painting medium, but medium. They make like a light one and a very light one and a warmer one. So they make all different types of Bristol yellow. And this Bristol yellow is just Kremer's in-house name for bismuth, basically bismuth pigments. So bismuth vanadate is a yellow pigment that's been created for the manufacturing of car colors, so we know that it's very light fast, right? It's extremely light fast, which is important. And it's not the only yellow that I use. I do also use Michael Harding's Yellow Lake because the Yellow Lake is a very transparent pigment, which means it's very good at staining darker colors and staining white if you really want the brightest yellowish white that you can possibly make, or the darkest yellowish dark that you can possibly make. You need a transparent pigment. This is not that. This is opaque, which means that it's going to slightly darken white when you add it to white, even when you're warming it up that way, but it's also going to brighten deep darks. So if you mix it with black to get a nice green, you can do that, but you're not going to be able to get the darkest green that you can possibly get unless you use a transparent pigment like Michael Harding's Yellow Lake. So all that being said, it's January and I am getting ready to have all my supplies in order for the year, and that means stretching and preparing new canvases, and that also means making sure that I have enough of the paints that I use throughout the year kind of ready to go. And so you can see this tube is getting down to its last leg, and I found that this tube, which is a nice, like relatively big size tube, as you can see I had to kind of tape it because the edges of the metal of the tube were cracking with this amazing red tape. And also the cap, started to get kind of gummed up with paint as well. So I think this year I'm actually going to do like smaller tubes. So you can see some of these smaller tubes I have. I think that they're going to be more appropriate, and they're also going to be easier to travel around with. I won't use them as long, so the yellow won't have time to kind of like get all gummed up around the edges here, hopefully. So anyway, that's my plan. Now, I made I'll link in the description below to a complete paint making video that I made. And in that video, I'm making cobalt blue. But basically, the recipe and the formulas the recipe's a little bit different, but all the principles are exactly the same. So if you want more of a comprehensive paint making video, then please watch that video because that'll just explain everything much more. But in this video, I will show you just the general recipe that I'm using for this particular pigment, because every single pigment that you paint with will have its own proportions depending on the materials that you're using. Like, you're always, when you're making paint, the paint that I make, which is based on the information that I was provided by Michael Harding, you know, to make basically like the best paint with the least amount of additives that you can make. All it has in it is refined linseed oil and bleached beeswax. So, but when you have, and before you add the beeswax to the paint, you make a beeswax emulsion, which is beeswax and linseed oil combined together in specific ratios, which again is in that video that I linked to. And then, so you have the beeswax emulsion, you have the refined linseed oil, and then you have your pigment that you're going to use, whichever color that is, right? And depending on what paint you're making, every single paint will have its own unique formula between pigment, or proportions between pigment, oil, and beeswax or beeswax emulsion to get the kind of texture that you're looking for. And the general principle that I follow is you want to basically pack as much pigment into the oil as you can, meaning that you have the leanest paint that you can possibly make, so that if you are adding any medium to your paint when you're using it, you have like the least amount of dilution there. And they say that the more lean the paint is, the stronger paint film that you'll be creating. To a point, right? You don't want it to be so dry that it's like crumbling. It has to be paint, and it has to be you know, it has to have the texture of paint, not like dried paste or whatever. So anyway, so that's what I'm going to do today, and you can follow along if you like. But the basic recipe that I've found for this particular pigment is 12 parts pigment to 3 parts oil to 1 part beeswax emulsion. I found that really creates a beautiful Bristol yellow medium that's just like ready to go right out of the tube. And depending on what oil you're using, dries relatively quickly, which is nice. And you know, yeah, just works really well. So that's what I'm getting into today, and here's what it looks like. So one of the things that you'll see me doing is making notes in my notebook here. And I found this super valuable because what I do is I write down the formula that I used, that I came up with last time that worked really well. Again, in this case, it's 12 parts pigment to 3 parts oil to 1 part beeswax linseed oil emulsion. And, but sometimes, like in this particular instance, I'm going to use Michael Harding's refined linseed oil instead of my own washed linseed oil, which I've used in the past to make this particular paint. So it's really good to just keep track of, like, okay, I added this much and it seems to be coming out this way, and then, you know, I substituted this material for this material, and now it seems to be coming out this way. At least for me, keeping track of those things is a really helpful way to like keep track of what's working and maybe what isn't working, what's shifted, you know. And then so the next time I go to make paint, I'm ready to go, and I can kind of pick up where I left off, adding any additional refinements that might help to keep things consistent moving forward. So highly recommended. Another thing is that whenever I'm making paint, I really like to, I use this really nice sharp palette knife to just make sure that my each measurement is actually like level. You could do it, I mean, you could do this process like much more kind of carefree, willy-nilly, like whatever, you know, a heaping tablespoon of blah 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 and a blah 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 blah, but I'm like a precise half teaspoon measurement, and another precise half teaspoon measurement. For me, I just find that this process, doing it this way, makes sure that my recipes are really consistent. So that's what works for me. 12. And I kind of separated them, each one into a little peak, so that it's just easier to see and keep track of like how many I've done and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to change the camera angle because I think that this will give you a clearer view of what's going on. So that's 12 parts pigment to 3 parts oil. And then I have my beeswax, linseed oil, emulsion. Now I used this piece of wax paper to try and keep this from drying out at all. And although that probably worked decently well, what I would recommend is getting these spray cans of Argon on Amazon, which you can use to insulate your any paint that you have that's still like wet. You can, especially if you're keeping it like this, any linseed oil that you have, you're keeping it in a jar. If you spray a little bit of this argon, which is a noble gas, and it's heavier than oxygen, it's going to sink to the bottom and create a little barrier between the oxygen and the linseed oil that will keep this from drying at all. So that's actually what I'm going to use going forward, and I just learned about that recently. So, but that's a really great thing to know for sure. So, see, I'm just making sure that I have a nice, clean, level scoop of my beeswax, bleached beeswax linseed oil emulsion. Oh, my kitty Asha is coming back to sleep on the chair behind me. She wants to be next to me because she's wonderful. All right, so I'll just put this, kind of scrape this puppy off and dump it in there. That's really, really good. It's looking awesome. And so now I'm just going to, fold the pigment into the medium. And I'll just do this with a palette knife in the beginning. But then I will switch to my muller and really drive the pigment into the linseed oil and the linseed oil and beeswax emulsion. So you can see it's, looking at it at this stage, you would think like, how in the world is this going to turn into paint? Like, it doesn't seem possible that like this amount of oil could actually absorb more pigment than it already has. It looks so dry and like crumbly, but believe it or not, it will. You just have to use a little bit of pressure from the muller. And also it looks like I have a little bit more beeswax linseed oil emulsion on here. So, and it's good to start with a smallish amount, and once you've actually turned that into paint with the muller and you feel like it's a good consistency, then you kind of already have paint going, and then as you continue to add more pure pigment to the mix and build it up, then it's like somehow you're already starting with paint instead of starting with I don't know, it just seems to go better that way anyway. Now I think the marble that I'm working on, somebody actually informed me in the comments that the marble tends to absorb the oil, and I think that that's correct. That is most definitely correct. So in the beginning, I might have to add a little bit more oil than I thought I needed, just to compensate for the fact that the stone is absorbing some of the oil that I'm adding to it. So I'm just going to double the amount of linseed oil and beeswax emulsion that I have in this mixture right now. And then I'll come back and compensate with more pigment. I'm gonna wipe this thing nice and clean. Get this sucker nice and clean before I use it to get my next scoop of beeswax emulsion. Now you can really see the way the oil just swallows up the pigment. And this is a little bit more how it should be. So I do think that the stone does absorb. It's probably is better to work on glass or granite, as this person indicated to me. But at least this will get us started with a nice paint base. Just love the texture of it. It's so cool. And you can see the paint becoming smoother and smoother as we go. And personally, I just really love this process. And I just think it's so wonderful what you create with the materials. And you get to charge it up with all your good energy before you go and make a painting out of it. So right away, using the Michael Harding refined linseed oil versus my washed linseed oil, I can tell that this has a substantially different texture to it. It's much like you can tell that the linseed oil itself has kind of a fluffier quality to it, if that makes any sense. The other washed linseed oil that I was making, according to Tad Spurgeon's recipe, definitely had a heavier, more viscous consistency. I like both, but we'll see how it all comes out when it actually becomes the paint that's going onto the canvas instead of the paint that's just kind of sitting on my slab here. So now, of course, this has double the amount of linseed oil in it that we want in the final mixture. So pretty soon it's going to be time to add some more pigment to this. And you can see I'm getting much less like texture in the paint now. It's starting to look much more like a smooth actual paint instead of paint filled with sand or something like that. So before I do too much work to get this super smooth, I'm going to start to add more of the pigment to it and rebalance the recipe. And we'll see. Be interested to see how this comes out. So I'm just going to speed through this process where I'm going back and forth between adding more oil and adding more pigment to try and find the right balance in the formula. So the last time I had made the paint, like I said, the ratio of pigment to oil to beeswax linseed oil emulsion was 12 to 3 to 1. And that did shift a bit when using the Michael Harding oil, and maybe my stone was very dry and absorbent, and it absorbed more of the oil than it had the last time I made it. But in the end, the recipe that seemed to work for me was somewhere between a 10 to 3 to 1 or an 11 to 3 to 1 ratio. And I'm just going to skip forward here to the part in the video where I actually found the correct proportions and the paint started to look and feel the way that I wanted to move to the next stage. Now, you might think at this stage that wow, this is really nice paint. It feels so fluffy and spreadable and good. And well, you can see there's definitely too much texture to it. It definitely needs to be like ground into a smoother paint, but still, you know, but this is definitely too oily. I think it's too oily. So we got to add more pigment to it. It's got to be denser than that, much denser. So much leaner. This feels like a nicer transitional stage for the pigment. Like, it's not quite as like crumbly and dry. It's like it has a little bit more, you know, smush to it still, which I feel like this is usually what it's like, you know, when you first mix the elements together before pressing them together with pressure from the muller. So this is much more typical, actually, in terms of the pre-mulled texture that you want. And you can see it, this at least with this pigment, it has a much more kind of sticky quality to it. It's sticky, it's smushy, it's you know, it kind of like sticks, right, a little bit more, which I think that's a good sign. So we'll come in with the muller and apply the pressure. Yeah, that's better. That's already better because you're getting more of a glue-like quality to the paint. After a while, you got to have some muscle to work on this. It definitely is not easy. Takes a little bit of work to get the paint to the consistency that we're looking for. And it's still very much too grainy. A little bit of pressure, a little bit of time, a little bit of mulling, and it will come together. They also say that even letting the paint just have more time to sit, having the pigment have more time to sit with the oil, that actually makes a difference as well. Like that it will incorporate better as the oil like absorbs more into the pigment itself. And we'll see how that pans out. But basically, at this stage, it just kind of turns into a decent amount of work to just grind the pigment into the oil and until you get the consistency of paint that you want. Because at least with this particular pigment, you can see, like, I think you can kind of see, like, it's a little bit grainy, almost like it has sand in it. But if you just keep, like, working the paint with the muller, if you just keep working it and working it, just keep working it and working it, eventually it will turn into a increasingly smooth and pleasant consistency of paint. And that's, I mean, honestly, I don't know if there's rules about that from like a chemistry, or not a chemistry standpoint, but from like a paint consistency standpoint. But I just think it's going to handle nicer and be nicer on the painting if the smoother and smoother you can get it. So that's what I try to achieve for myself. Some people might like more texture, but I like it when it's nice and smooth. So I'm just gonna grind it until it's smooth. Now I actually think that I'm gonna get ahead a little bit quicker on increasing the smoothness of the paint if I do smaller quantities of grinding at once. So I'm actually gonna take some of this and separate it out from the pile and just work on a smaller portion of it at once. And then I'll do like another portion and another portion and another portion. And I think in that way, I'll be able to achieve something approximating the smoothness that I want faster, because there'll be less like there'll be less paint between the muller and the slab. And in that way, I'll get like a finer, you see how fine that is? This is actually like spreading out nice and thin and nice and fine. And that's gonna really help me get a nicer, smoother grind of paint. And already, I don't know if you can actually see that, but it's much nicer. There we go. That's much more what I'm looking for. And I'm just gonna zoom in with the camera so that you can see hopefully a little better. This is the paint before I ground it smooth, right? So you can see that kind of the texture there that is like a little bit too grainy. And then once I was able to grind it out more smoothly with the muller, then I'm getting something that's much smoother and that kind of paint consistency that, you know, we're used to seeing out of a tube, right? And that's basically what you want. So now I'm just going to work basically in small batches until all of this paint on the left here is turned into nice smooth paint that I can put into a tube. All right, so you can see that I started out thinking that I'd just be following the same ratio of pigment to linseed oil to beeswax emulsion as I've done in the past, but it turned out to be a little bit different. And that's okay, that's to be expected. And I also think that the paint that I had been using over the last year or so, it tends to be a little bit harder and drier than I would have liked. So I think having a slightly higher amount of linseed oil in the paint is actually going to work out really well for me. But you can still see that it holds its form in a very sculptural, physical way, which I like, but it's also very malleable and plastic, but also glue-like. So it kind of strikes the perfect balance between all the qualities that I'm looking for. So I had done 30 half teaspoon measures of pigment, 9 half teaspoon measures of oil, and 3 half teaspoon measures of my beeswax linseed oil emulsion, which again, if you want to know more about the beeswax linseed oil emulsion, you can see my full paint making video in the link in the description below. So all that's left for me to do is to pack this into my smaller tubes and I'll be ready to go for the year. So that's it for my paint making video on making Bristol Yellow Medium. And if you guys have any questions or comments for me, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know, and I'll talk to you soon. All right.